Episode 2. The Romans are coming, and that's bad news for the Celts. Welcome back to the Return to My Trees series of the Tramping podcast. In the last episode, I started walking through Wentwood Forest in Gwent and exploring a bit of the Druidic kind of connections. I'm back here now in the heart of the forest because I'm going to start looking at the Roman influence and what happened when they arrived on these shores. So walk with me as we go deeper into Wentwood Forest. I'm back in Wentwood Forest, continuing my walk through the woodlands of Wales. In the last episode, I discovered some of the ancient history of this woodland and how it might have been a spiritual place for the Silurian Celts and Druids who gave them wisdom and spiritual guidance. Now I'm walking on the main forestry track. You can hear the wind rustling through the trees. It's a Spartan scene, ramshackle conifer plantation that frankly has seen better days. What the Druids would have made of this demoralized part of this forest is anyone's guess. 1,000 years ago, though, Wentwood would have been dominated, not by these conifers, but mainly by oak trees. Over the centuries, though, successive generations of local dwellers reshaped this vast woodland as they used it for hunting, cultivated it for agriculture, and managed it for timber. By the late 13th century, Cistercian monks from nearby Tintern Abbey were utilising Wentwood by buying all the available bark from felled oak trees in the forest for use in their tannery. Local people, meanwhile, depended on the woods to provide materials for repairing their homes, for fuel, for a place to graze livestock, to fatten up their pigs by letting them forage for acorns, known in those days as pannage, and a source for creating honey and wax from the wild bees that lived there. In some ways, you could say the woods were a B&Q of the medieval age. By the 17th century, farmers were working the edges of the forest while other wealthy landowners harvested the old oaks through coppicing to produce charcoal for their ironwork ventures. Coppicing is the woodland management technique whereby trees are felled at their base, then allowed to regrow, so providing a sustainable supply of timber. In the 19th century, the then landowners, the Dukes of Beaufort, converted much of Wentwood to conifer plantation, the fast-growing trees quickly shading out many of the remaining oak and beech trees that had been coppiced through the ages. By the end of the First World War, most of the remaining native hardwood trees that were taken in order to support the war effort also were replaced by conifers. The monoculture undermined a woodland ecosystem that previously thrived in the mixed oak forest. Over the past few decades, there's been a concerted effort to restore Wentwood's ancient heritage. In 2005, the Woodland Trust purchased half of the forest, some 430 acres, from the State-owned Forestry Commission after it raised £1.5 million thanks to the support of 250,000 members, local people and celebrities such as the author Bill Bryson and actor Dame Judi Dench. Since then, the Trust has assumed control of the rest of the forest and has gained accreditation under the Queen's Commonwealth Canopy Initiative to create a sustainable conservation area. Being the starting point of a national forest for Wales could only speed up Wentwood's rehabilitation. There's one tree in this part of Wentwood Forest that I'm particularly keen to find. Its name is curly oak, and it's the forest's oldest living tree, by some estimates over 900 years old. The OS map offers a general sense of where this Wentwood elder is located. So I've exited the forestry track and I'm following a winding path south down through an older part of this woodland. This part of the forest feels very, very different. Here, Wentwood has been transformed from a dusty, enslaved conifer landscape into a rich, cool, and decidedly unkempt woodland, a mix of pine and ancient oak. The forest floor has come alive. Bright green moss springs up everywhere, and clusters of white fungi grow at the base of the trees. I wonder if the Silurians would have used this part of the forest. Could this have been an ancient hunting ground? Or was this once a favoured Druid place for cutting mistletoe? Today, the trees that would know the Druid secrets have long gone. But in this part of Wentwood, at least, you get a sense that the spirit of the forest is still alive. So, I've got here what I think certainly looks like curly oak, though it is covered in foliage. So, but I think it meets the description. So, here's what I can see. Right, at one time, this oak might have dominated this part of the forest. At its peak, apparently, the tree's girth was said to be an impressive 6.35 meters. But nowadays, the old-timer is a shadow of its former self, more a robust skeleton than a full tree. Curly's trunk has been split in two, though fresh branches and leaves continue to grow out of one flank. Even today, in its aged state, the gap between the two sections of the trunk is wide enough to stand in the middle. It's time to head back up to the main forestry track and keep on my journey to Caerleon. The path from Curly Oak climbs back up the hill. I can see daylight through the trees to my right. I'm getting close to the edge of Wentwood Forest. And Bertholai Graig, that's the ridge that drops down precipitously to the Usk Valley and the A449 road that links Wales and the Midlands of England. The forest is quiet, but in the distance I can just hear the faint hum of cars as they head up the main road. I've reached Caer Lysyn. Caer means fort in Welsh. On the OS map, it is marked as a motte and bailey, a style of fortification introduced by the Normans around the 11th century. But there is some disagreement about its validity. Some amateur historians speculate that it's a folly built just a few centuries ago. Others believe it predates the Normans and perhaps was an Iron Age or Bronze Age site. I can still make out the contours of a fortified structure situated on the top of the hill and surrounded by a neat cluster of trees. I can't help but think back to the Silurians, who had built a similar fort a mile or so east at a similar elevation near the village of Llanmelin. Could Caer Lysyn have been part of their defence against the Roman invaders who arrived in Wales around AD 48? It'd be nice to think so. By the time the Romans came knocking, the Celts of Wales, Ireland and Scotland were the last holdouts against a military machine that had routed all of Europe and most of what we now know as England. In Wales, the Celts, many being refugees from Gaul, had settled in small agricultural hamlets amid a matrix of oak forests, just like Wentwood would have been. A century before, General Julius Caesar had been repulsed by Celtic warriors. This time, the Romans took no chances, arriving in Wales with an overwhelming force. Still, they hadn't factored in the ferocity of the Silures and their charismatic leader Caradog, known to the Romans as Caractacus. In a series of guerrilla attacks over a period of 5 or 6 years, the Silures terrified the Roman forces by springing ambushes, then retreating into their woodland hiding places. In his book The Annals 15, The Roman historian and politician Tacitus recounts the similar problems faced during earlier campaigns in Scotland, writing, "When we used to plunge into the woods and thickets, all the hostile tribesmen charged straight at us. Then, after the initial skirmish, as the Romans chased the marauders back into the woods, they rallied and profited by their local knowledge to ambush the first rash pursuers." Ultimately, the Romans prevailed, and Caradog was captured and taken in chains to Rome. Even then, he was able to win himself a pardon and his freedom because Emperor Claudius was impressed by his bravery. Surprisingly, Caradog chose to live out the rest of his days in sunny Rome, rather than returning to the cold, wet forests of South Wales. His countrymen and women back home didn't fare so well. Frustrated by the way the Celts could launch raids then disappear, and to break the Celtic spirit once and for all, they decided to annihilate the Druids. In AD 61, the Roman general Paulinus drew up plans to attack the island of Mona, what we now call Ynys Mon, Anglesey in English. This was the spiritual stronghold of the Druids. According to Tacitus, Paulinus led his legions out of their stronghold in Chester and marched them towards Mona. The Roman army needed timber to build the flat-bottomed landing crafts it would use to cross the Menai Straits, the narrow channel of water that separated Mona from the mainland. It also required timber to shore up the defences of the camps and forts it erected as it advanced. Furthermore, it needed straight, wide military roads to effectively move the army around and, importantly, minimize forest ambushes. To address this need for timber and to remove the threat of ambushes posed by the Celts, the Romans set about felling all the woodlands on their route to Mona. In doing so, they ramped up their military and economic power over the local population. And, just as the carving of roads through forests continues to threaten indigenous communities all around the world today, the Romans hastened the demise of Celtic resistance. But they still had to conquer the island of Mona. When they reached the island, the Roman soldiers froze at the sight of the Druids. Tacitus recounted the scene this way. On the shore stood the opposing army with its dense array of armed warriors, while between the ranks dashed women in black attire like the Furies, with hair dishevelled, waving brands. All around, the Druids, lifting up their hands to heaven and pouring forth dreadful imprecations, scared our soldiers by the unfamiliar sight, so that, as if their limbs were paralyzed, they stood motionless and exposed to wounds. Then, urged by their general's appeal and mutual encouragements not to quail before a troop of frenzied women, they bore the standards onwards, smote down all resistance, and wrapped the foe in the flames of its own brands. A force was next sent over the conquered, and their oak groves, devoted to inhuman superstitions, were destroyed. They deemed it indeed a duty to cover their altars with the blood of captives and to consult their deities through human entrails. Clearly, something about the Druids really spooked the Romans. Both Tacitus and Pliny describe how the Druids indulged in human sacrifice, and the latter suggested it was outrage at such practices that drove Rome to wipe them out. But some modern scholars believe that the real threat posed by the Druids was ideological. One, Jean Markle, has argued that the Druids, with their affinity to the natural world, represented an absolute threat to the Roman state because their nature-based philosophy contradicted Roman materialism. Perhaps, then, we should be considering the ancient Druids through a completely different prism. I like the idea of them being the forefathers of the modern environmental movement, stewards and protectors of the forest against the myopic, materialistic demands of the Roman Empire. I've made it to the edge of Wentwood Forest, and I'm joining a trail called the Usk Valley Walk. Below me, the River Usk takes broad turns to make its way downstream, like a sedate skier making wide slaloms down a mountain. On its far bank sits Celtic Manor Golf Resort, the fairways and greens of its 2010 Ryder Cup Championship course squeezed in among the floodplain. By AD 90, the Romans had taken full control of the lands occupied by the Welsh Celts. The now vanquished Silurians were persuaded to live in a new Roman settlement just below Wentwood called Venta Silurum, or Caer Went, from which the forest and indeed the entire region of Gwent is named. As they did throughout the world, the Romans shored up their military gains by building a network of armed garrisons throughout Wales, connected by a series of stone roads. One of their most important forts was called Isca Silurum. We know it as Caerleon, on the banks of the River Usk, and that's where I'm headed now. You've been listening to Return to My Trees, a Tramping podcast. It was narrated by Matthew Yeomans and edited by Dullan Yeomans. The musical interludes are by the folk duo Filkin's Drift. Join us for the next episode, where we delve even deeper into the woodlands of Wales.